Okay, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Scrum at scale. It's a big buzzword these days, scaling Scrum. Scrum Inc. has a 2-day session we're doing this week here, and it's approved by the Scrum Alliance for credit and all that sort of thing. So, we've been scaling Scrum a long time. My colleague, Professor Takeuchi, wrote a paper in 1986 about the best teams in the world, teams that they saw at Honda, Canon, 3M, later at Toyota, and they called it Scrum Project Management. And it took us 30 years to get another paper into the Harvard Business Review. But this last month in May, we published a paper in the Harvard Business Review, Embracing Agile. It's for managers. It goes through all the ways that managers can screw up a Scrum by not understanding what Agile is and how to remedy that. And it was fascinating because the leadership of the Harvard Business Review called in their employees after they published the paper and asked their employees, what are they doing to screw up agility at the Harvard Business School Press. So Scrum has been around a long time. Now, interestingly, we worked with many companies. When we look at what they're doing, they're radically different. So we have a Defense Department contractor who lost a $400 million radar contract to a Scrum competitor. And they came to us and they said, the government just told us we will never get another contract again unless we can deliver at half price. So their strategy is to be able to, they made a bid on a $1 billion destroyer for half price, and now they have to deliver. So they can't just do Agile, okay? Because there's a lot of Agile out there that was pointed out last night. They don't have working software at the end of the sprint. They will never deliver at half price. So now we have this huge Scrum that actually has to execute. So they're a very different kind of company than another example, Autodesk. They're the leading company in the field in CAD and many different areas. And they've been buying up any company that's a competitor, and what they're finding is the companies they're buying are doing better Scrum than they are. So they've already been doing Scrum for almost 10 years. They said, Jeff, you need to come in and retrain everybody. We need to ramp the whole level of Scrum implementation. We need to innovate faster. We need to be more agile. We need to move everything to the cloud. And we need to do it now with this huge company. Another example that's totally different is I'm in Stockholm at least a couple of times a year, and Henrik Nyberg, who I work with there, always brings me over to Spotify, and we talk with the coaches there, find out what they're doing. And they're a radically different animal. They're all about fast innovation, autonomous teams, self-organization. The whole company is one big self-organized thing. Today, it's almost approaching 2,000 developers. Okay, so their Scrum at scale is radically different than a lot of what's talked about in the industry. But we're seeing now, next week I'll be in ING Bank in Amsterdam. They're trying to do exactly what Spotify is doing. They're implementing Spotify's Scrum at scale, which is really interesting because they have thousands of people, but they want to do Scrum really well. Okay, so in order to do it really well, we need to start by, what are you trying to do? What is your objective? Where do you want to go? Are you rigid in following rules, or are you continuously improving, changing the process? Are you interested in a static design, or are you interested in rapid innovation and change? Okay, So I've thrown Apple in here. You know, it's a big company. They have to be pretty stable, but they're on the innovation side of the ledger. Microsoft Windows had problems. They're trying to get that all agile now. Okay, so our Defense Department contractor is down there, and they want to even get more fixed rules and a very stable design for that destroyer. Okay, as fast as possible. Autodesk is over here, more into continuous improvement, but not agile enough. They want to move up here. They want to be like Spotify. That's their goal, is to get to where Spotify is. And Microsoft wants to get up there as well. So Microsoft does have, Ken and I worked with their development tools organization, and they do deploy every sprint. In fact, what we know now is a third of the companies, the latest surveys show, a third of the companies today deploy every sprint or more often. How many are deploying every sprint or more often in here? It's not quite a third. But in the US, it's a third of the companies, and that's growing, okay? So I'm amazed that there are still so many people out there that are wondering if they should get agile or if they really need to deploy more often when their competition is already 2 miles down the road, okay? So what we've done with Scrum at Scale is not try to prescribe everything, but ask questions, okay? What are the pieces of the implementation that need to work? And the outer ring is all about the product owner. How does a company have a vision? How does that translate into portfolio management across product lines? How does products get managed within a portfolio? How do they get release plans for those products, to get teams to deliver and release, get customer feedback, updating their global strategy? And in the middle, we focus on the teams. How do the teams float issues all the way to the top of the organization? How does the organization coordinate teams? So we spent 2 days talking about that, and every component has goals and objectives, inputs and outputs. And every scaling method does a version of this. They all have to deal with these components. And they do them in slightly different ways. And sometimes they prescribe specific methods. But as we look at companies, we see they start differently. You know, the Department of Defense had to spend 2 years working with, or the defense contract had to spend 2 years working with the Department of Defense to get them to agree to accept reports based on points, earned value, burn up in points. And only then could they get the contract started. And so they had a lot of metrics that they had to manage, and then they had to drive. They only have one project, the destroyer, with all the guns and everything, and they need to deliver that to the teams. Meanwhile, Autodesk and Spotify are just are going at it in a completely different way. So for each company, we have to ask, what is your objective? What is your biggest point of pain? How will you address that? How will you scrum your company? So to do that, we need leadership development. So here's Moore's Law. You know, Moore drew on the back of a napkin. What is the cheapest price of a transistor and how many transistors on a chip? And in 1960, I think that is, can't quite read that, 10 transistors on a chip cost this much. But by 65, 100 transistors on a chip cost this much, and by 70, 1,000 transistors on a chip. And that keeps increasing, and that makes your computer twice as fast every 18 months and makes the cost cheaper. So in the early 90s, I was working with the OMG, and we were talking about how do we do that in software, because hardware is accelerating faster than software. And that discussion was all around when we were creating Scrum. And, you know, what we see is in a beginner Scrum, maybe you can get 10 stories done in a sprint, and this is the cost. And if you can get really ready, done, you have real working software, maybe you can deliver 100 stories in a sprint, and the cost per story is much lower. And if you can get to continuous delivery, maybe you can deliver 1,000 stories during a sprint, the cost is much lower. We're getting on the ramp, okay? That's what's happening. And David Rico sent me his latest paper a couple of weeks ago. He says, here's my analysis of the return on investment for DevOps, okay? If you just catch your bugs in operations, you know, after it gets deployed, we'll call that zero return on investment. If you do some manual testing, you can do much better. If you do some traditional testing, it's better. We're working with a lot of companies where the QA managers won't give up traditional testing. They argue that that's the way to do it. That if we were to move to, well, software inspections help, if we were to put testers on the teams and move to continuous integration and start automating testing, they don't realize that is, it's such a big number better, I can't even divide it in my head, okay? And yet these guys won't give it up. But now we're going continuous delivery, at least every day, multiple times a day. How many are doing that in here? What we're seeing is about 5% of the companies in the US are doing that. But what about DevOps? DevOps means it's total automation. There are no humans. A 72,000% increase in return on investment for testing and operations. If you're not doing that and your competitor is, game over, right? So the pressure is on, and it is accelerating. That's another thing people don't realize. It's accelerating faster. If you think it was tough this year, it's going to get tougher next year to compete. So you've got to get agile. So here's, you know, as a military academy graduate, here's some people that inspired me. You know, I studied Sun Tzu. He learned how to win a battle without ever firing a shot. That's an important skill to have as a Scrum Master. Miyamoto Musashi was the greatest swordsman in the world ever. Japanese swordsman. He never lost a battle, and all were fought to the death. And as he got older, and actually not that old, he decided to retire and write a book because he felt the pen was mightier than the sword. And when I used to be VP of engineering in big banking companies, I had his book on my desk every day. And I would walk in and I would open a page, I'd read his strategy, and then I would go implement it that day. I always implemented something in his book every day because he trained in the way of two swords. He always had a long sword to deal with the cavalry on horses that were coming at him, and a short sword to fight in close. And the movements were the same no matter what he was doing. And that was his skill, to be able to address anything. And in large systems architecture, which I've been involved in for many years, you always need a long-term architectural strategy and a short-term move. And so Musashi taught me how to do that better. At West Point, we studied von Clausewitz, a famous German general. This is probably the most famous book ever written on war. And the learning from that is that as soon as you try to execute anything, even a software project, bad things happen. You know, there's a lot of noise and confusion. Sometimes there's smoke and fire, and communication breaks down, and everything conspires to prevent you from getting stuff done. And so how to operate in what Clausewitz called the fog of war is kind of fundamental capability that an agile leader would need to have. And finally, you know, for me, as a former fighter pilot, the world's best fighter pilot ever, John Boyd, his OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, the quick decision-making that you make in the air and recycling that decision every few seconds. It's what we train product owners in. I also have a lot of background, or I spent a lot of years studying the martial arts, because Scrum is really, you know, it's more like the tango. If you read the book on the tango, it doesn't really help you. You actually have to get out on the floor and build it into muscle memory. So here's my Scrum Master. He's a US champion Tai Chi master. This is just a funny picture showing that he can eat his hamburger while he's doing his move. I put a picture of Willie here because he's sitting right down in front, the founder of Edge of Scrum. So, you know, he'll talk to you tonight maybe about how Aikido plays into his strategy with the kids. But I was fortunate to study for some years under two of the direct disciples of Yui Shiba. And what they taught me was not so much the physical movement, but the mindset, the agile mindset. Now, a lot of people complain in my courses, the women complain there's not enough feminine models, okay? But I have a good one. My granddaughter, she's coming along. When she gets old enough, maybe she'll be up here showing all the women how to, the way of two swords, right? So the problem with getting organizations agile, as Professor Carter's been pointing out at Harvard, it's like two different operating systems. Agile is like the Mac OS, Waterfall is like Windows. And if you try to run a Windows program on Mac OS, it doesn't work, right? So you need people running the Agile who actually understand the Mac OS. Here's a Windows programmer. He says, I've never used a Mac. I need some guidance. Hey, the Mac framework was very different. It's possible to write Windows-style applications on the Mac, but if you do, it looks really ugly and it runs slow. You know, if you actually work in the Mac environment, it's stunningly fast. Okay? How many people have a stunningly fast Scrum? We got a problem here. As Gunther said last night, we definitely are not done. Okay? We need to figure out how to get these Scrums agile. Now, this month, end of the month, I'm going back to General Electric's startup in the Valley. They invested $1 billion. It was agile from day one. They got up to 1,000 developers and $3 or $4 billion in revenue within 3 or 4 years. The chief executive came to my Scrum class. He said, Jeff, I'm here to learn how to walk the walk and talk the talk. And you're going to come back with me after I'm a certified Scrum Master and train all my managers and all my business leaders in Scrum. And now this year, I'm going back again, just to work with the managers, give them basic Scrum training. And they use Lean Startup for a lot of their hardware. And if the Lean Startup runs into a bureaucratic problem, the CEO of General Electric will come down and smash the bureaucracy. How many of you have CEOs that are smashing bureaucracy in your organization? Doesn't happen in Germany, I guess. Huh? Okay, well, we got one. The agile mindset means the leader is going to be out there whacking the organization and moving it into an agile configuration, okay? And GE, when I was there last year, at the end of the week, the chief executive there said, Jeff, GE has decided to become a digital company. Today I have 1,000 developers. Tomorrow I have 37,000 developers. Every software developer in GE is going to report to me. And we are going to get them all agile. And 3 months later, corporate headquarters of GE in Stanford, outside of New York City, said, we're out here in the midst of the waterfall world. We need to get out of here. They moved right into the tech center in Boston, right next to the venture capital firm I work with, on the street that is just Scrum end to end. So that's what an agile company does. We have some good examples. Well, let me talk about that. But most companies, we're talking today coming in, agile means those guys down in IT run faster. Up at the top, we're going to have our same waterfall reports, our same hierarchy, our same slowness, and we might need a translation layer, right? If you run a Windows app on a Mac, you have to have the translation layer. We have to make it safe for Windows. It might look funny and run slow, but it sort of works. We call that fragile. You cannot sustain agility long term with a strategy, because it doesn't address one of the core problems, which is organizational debt. This is actually Skype. It shows you all the dependencies between teams at Skype that prevented them from, they changed one line of code, it took 7 months to deliver the product. Maybe Henrik this afternoon will tell you how he fixed Ericsson. Where are you, Henrik? Because that probably looked like Ericsson 10 years ago. So to get a sustainable implementation, you need self-organizing teams that are driving, and the managers move to the side and are supporting the agility. And that's what's happening in companies that are really focused on agility, even in big companies like SAP and Microsoft. You know, the CEO of Microsoft last year, he banned all test teams. How many of you still have test teams? A lot of you. It's amazing to me that managers don't look at, when the CEO of one of the leading software companies in the world bans all test teams, every software CEO should ask, why do we have any test teams? Why don't they do that? They have no agile mindset. If the CEO doesn't have an agile mindset, the organization will not execute agilely. So we really need leadership. They need to set aggressive goals. They need to change the organization and remove organizational debt. They need to, any impediments the teams can't remove themselves, they need to be focused on moving. I'm amazed that managers will pay product owners and they're not measure value delivery per point. They're not measuring their return on investment. And also they have Scrum Masters, and you look at the teams and they're not improving. Why would you pay for a Scrum Master for a team that's not improving, right? It wouldn't make sense. You'd be better off with no Scrum Master. You can get a team easily that won't improve without a Scrum Master. So there is a need for leadership. And you'd be surprised there's a lot of companies out there that have leadership and no managers. That may be the emerging future. We'll see. So my approach to scaling is before you even talk about scaling Scrum, you have to descale. Like after you've been running your cappuccino machine for a year or two, the pipes start to get clogged up, right? So you have to descale the cappuccino machine and clean out those pipes. So here's the way we like to work. Here's a hardware company building web server infrastructure so for corporations to install cloud. And the Agile coach, they claim to be Agile, but the Agile coach said, Jeff, I think you need to come in and train the managers because they don't get it. So we come in and we do the standard Scrum Master training for managers. And we talk about how they don't have good continuous integration, they don't have good automated testing, they don't have testers on the teams, they have all this broken stuff. They're supposed to be an Agile company, and they're the managers, and they're responsible. Why aren't they fixing this? So to their credit, the very next sprint, this team, they stabilized the team, they stopped disrupting the team. The team's velocity improved 600% immediately, and then started going up. Here they started implementing the patterns that we teach in our training, the interrupt pattern, a buffer for interrupts. They're starting to burn down technical debt. They have innovation stories. They're starting to invent. They're putting the Kaizen, the process improvement, they find in the retrospective as the top priority story in the sprint. And the velocity goes to 160 in 5 3-week sprints. This is good execution. This is stunningly great Scrum, right? Here, they went down, and when they did a root cause, they found a manager had cut a secret deal with a developer to work off the backlog. And when the team found out, they were furious. They brought it back up. Meanwhile, the coach has 9 other teams coming right up the curve. So if 10 teams go 5 times as fast, then he's got the equivalent of 50 old teams. He's done it in 5 sprints. 50 old teams means 40 free teams. At 7 people each, he's got 280 people for nothing. But that is scaling Scrum. You get hundreds of people's capability without hiring a single person. That's the way to start. Now, once you have that, then you want to replicate that across, because now they got 50, 60 more teams that we need to replicate that right across the organization. So here's the way we're thinking about this. You know, in order to transform the organization with Scrum, we need to deal with the fog of war. We need to get real change and deliver real value. And in order to do that, we need to stop wasteful practices. And to save companies, the leadership and the management needs to start to execute John Boyd's OODA loop. So we need to deal with 3 I call them the meta issues. There needs to be someone in charge of changing the organization. It would be ideal if the whole senior management team was agile, but that's usually not the case. So we need an executive action team that is agile, and their job is to define the new operating system rules and get rid of all the crud, in their old software development lifecycle, because that will just break the agile. Second thing is the organization needs to be aligned. When we go into organizations with 1,000 developers, one of the first things we find out is 300 of them are working on stuff that nobody wants. And when the business finds out what they're doing, they want them to stop. They're self-generating code that's going to have to be maintained for the next 20 years. So it's worse than just wasting 300 people. You're creating work for many more people 20 years in the future by putting junk into the system. So we have to get the whole organization focused on such that every team has a clear ordered backlog at the beginning of every sprint that they can execute on. And the biggest problem we have is that managers want to mess with that backlog. When we created Scrum, that was one of the driving principles when I created Scrum. Managers are not good at getting the right backlog for what customers need because they don't spend all their time with the customers. They spend too much time doing other stuff. So to be a product owner, you need to spend at least half the time with the customers and the other half of the time explaining to the team exactly what the customers want. There's some leaders that do that, like Steve Jobs, even Bill Gates would spend half of their time on the product. What does the customer need? And they got rid of all that administrative stuff. They cleared their desk so they could do that. But most managers are not there. So we need a product owner organization that can really get the focus. And we need a way for management to synchronize that with that product owner organization on a regular cadence. So we call that a Meta Scrum. The product owner teams are meeting regularly with the managers. They're agreeing that, yes, this is the backlog. If they need anything from the managers, they need to support them. If the management wants to change the backlog, they need to negotiate with the product owners. Everybody needs to get aligned and agreed, this is what we're going to execute this sprint. Third thing is delivering early and often. We've already talked about the Devops issue. And we want to use Scrum to scrum the organization to make the Scrum better. 125 teams. In Silicon Valley, every company I've been in has a lot more than 125 teams. I've been in dozens of companies, and they all have at least 200 Scrum teams. If you get 80% of 125 teams going twice as fast, that's worth $100 million of additional product development this year. That's a big number. You ought to be willing to spend $10 million to make that happen, right? And many of ours spending $10 million, but it's not happening. So they need to really address what is really going on there. This agility thing, there's a lot of what Jim Copeland calls laid back, California, long hair, hippie style, guitar playing, agile. That's the one where the teams don't get better. So we need an executive action team that changes the rules. Their job is to change that organization, remove organizational debt. We need a Meta Scrum that meets regularly to synchronize the managers and the product owners, get them all on the same page, and make sure the organization is aligned. We use the Scrum of Scrums to coordinate the teams, but to my amazement, a lot of people are using the Scrum of Scrums just to talk about impediments. in the companies that I've been in, the Scrum of Scrums is responsible for delivering the product at the end of every sprint or more often. And if they don't do that, the Scrum of Scrums Master gets fired. Because why would you have a group of Scrum Masters who can't deliver? Not only deliver, but actually make delivery go faster and faster and faster. That's their job, right? So we go see. We usually work with the leadership. We get them committed to, there needs to be a leadership action team, an executive action team. We need to start training everyone. Everyone in the CSM training, all the business people in the CSPO training. We need that product owner organization that can get the alignment. I mean, that is kind of the beginning of success, where you have that organization that can make the priorities clear. We get that executive action team meeting. They build a backlog of organizational change that they're going to execute on. And then we start team launches. And we usually take 6 to 9 teams at once. We boot them up, get them going. That will usually take about 6 weeks. When we have success there, then we'll go to the next 9 teams, and then the next, and then the next. We're working with at 3M now. We got 1,200 developers, and it's going to take about a year to get all those teams booted up properly. We run assessments on everything. We start to build a coaching team internally. We feel if we cannot build good internal agile coaches, that operation, that agile operation can't be sustainable. And it's really hard to find, train, and build internal coaching staff. Here's just a sample of assessment. We went into one of the teams, one of the early teams at 3M. They were doing Scrum. We run our assessment. You can see the Scrum Master's got a little bit of green here, is trying. Everything else is in the red. We put a coach in there. One sprint later, everything started to turn green. And I don't have, with this team, within 4 or 5 sprints, their velocity had increased 500%. Just by getting some good coaching. So a lot of times we go in, oh, we've scaled Scrum. We look at it, it kind of looks like this. So we kind of have to reset, and relaunch. We really need the senior executives not only buy-in, but participating in the process. And at 3M now, we're working with $1 billion division, and the senior executive is the chief product owner. She is working with her product owners all the time. She is meeting on a weekly basis with her executives and her other product owner team to align product ownership with the management of the organization. That's what we like to see. We train everybody. We do backlog workshops. These are critical for POs, getting good backlog. If we can get this PO's organization and the backlog flowing right, as I said, this is the key to success. We do backlog workshops with the teams. We train them in story mapping. We work with the team issues as we're doing that. Team size is usually a problem. Harvard research shows that the best team size is 4.6 people. In my company, if we have a team of 9, we split it immediately, and the velocity always goes up at least 30% as soon as we split. Small teams go faster. Then we do a 5-day team launch where the coaches are working with the team, ramping them up. We make sure they're resolving impediments. We want them actually coding. At one of my companies some years ago, we had the practice. For a new person coming onto the Scrum, they have to have code in a working build by 5 o'clock the first day. And we wouldn't hire anybody that we didn't think could do that. And we had to change the whole structure of the company to make that possible. HR, you can't have them for 4 hours. You can get them an hour in the morning. Development team, their whole working environment needs to be set up before they even come in. As soon as they get out of their HR briefing, developers need to be training. How do they use the build system? How do they code? Before noon, they have to have real stuff they're working on. So that afternoon, they can build code, get it into the build. It's working. As I said, team size is an issue. In the early days, it's hard to get it fixed. We know 5 is right. We might have to put up with a little bit larger teams because they have bigger fish to fry, and we'll circle around later and get that fixed. Requires a lot of coaching of leadership because you have to ask the question, a large team is a slow team. We know if a 6-person team takes a year, a 10-person team takes a year and a half. That is hard data on hundreds and hundreds of projects. With that data, why would a manager allow a team of 10? It's because their mindset is they don't have an agile mindset. They're not executing on what they should know. They either don't know or they're not doing. We have to fix that. And we found there always has to be a reason why. We never do anything because Scrum says so. Who cares what Scrum says? We do it because here's the hard data and multiple papers in the IEEE library that shows you if you do this, your production doubles. And if they don't want to know why, let's read the papers. Let's understand specifically why. So we have to do the whys all the time and get a repeatable process. And for the companies we work with, like the defense contractor, it actually has to work or they're going to lose $500 million. So lots of challenges, getting the right teams, getting the POs, getting the coachings, finding quality coaches. It's a real challenge. Getting the enterprise action team working and getting a clean line of communication between them and the rest of the organization. If we can, getting the CEO and the C-suite as the executive action team. And, I've been working with a venture capital group for 10 years, and our approach to Scrum is we go in, we immediately double or triple velocity in the engineering. That's easy. Then we go right to the financials. If production is doubled, why haven't sales doubled? Oh, you've got a problem in your marketing strategy, your market segmentation, your product owner organization. We spend 80% of our time fixing that, getting the senior managers aligned, getting the product owners working, getting the sales connected, and only 20% of the time getting the engineers to go fast. That's easy. Because we expect if production doubles, the valuation of the company must double, or there's something broken. So this direct connect all the way through is critical. And so here's an example of a successful Scrum implementation. This is the SEC report for Pegasystems. And during this year, we were implementing Scrum. And the valuation of the company went up 400%. Right? You want the production to go up 400%? Twice the work in half the time, that's the name of my book. That means production goes up 400%, and if you fix the chain, then valuation goes up 400%. That's the goal. Then you win, right? So, that's my story for this morning. It's all about getting things done, and clearly we're not done yet, as Gunther talked about last night, right? And there's a lot of need for agile leadership. So I think the rest of the day you're going to get some talks by some good leaders. Henrik is here from Ericsson. He's done a great job there at Ericsson. He can talk you through the details of actually making all this happen. So maybe some questions, Jean-Pierre?
Yeah.
Do we have time?
Not so much. Yeah. 4 minutes. 4 minutes for questions. So, any questions? I would say let's take 3. No one? Ah, Stefan.
After you reach the 400%, what happens with the curve? It flattens, right? Or did you get my point?
Actually, I show in the Scrum Master class, we have a curve that's been running for 5 years, and it just keeps going. And people always keep saying, does it ever stop? And I say no, and they say, how do you know? And I say, I know because I've had teams that work like the All Blacks, and I ask them, what happens in the rugby field when someone fumbles the ball? They say every team member throws themselves at that ball. And I say, I'm not seeing that in the company. You know, people are running into problems. Everybody's standing around doing nothing. When you start looking at the All Blacks, then maybe we'll think you're topped out. They say, you're right, I guess. They go back to work. The velocity keeps on going up.
Thank you.
Another question?
You need to know that the Scrum Alliance, many of the people in the Scrum Alliance are not happy about my position on this. But I'm like, this is the reason I created Scrum. I didn't create it just so you could make money by creating Scrum teams that suck. I don't buy that.
Cool. There's another question over there.
I have a short question about the Meta Scrum. Could you maybe spend 1 minute explaining exactly what that is and who's included in that in the company?
Well, for the last 15 years in the companies I work with, where I've been in head of engineering, but also in the venture teams, we really like this. We need the senior management meeting regularly with the product owner team and usually the engineering leadership, Scrum Masters, on a regular cadence, where the chief product owner presents the backlog. Okay, here's the backlog. Here's what's happened since our last meeting. We've got these new sales contracts. Our competitors are doing this to us. We've had these issues in development. And given the situation, we want to adjust our strategy in future sprints to head in this direction. And we might need some more money, some more people or whatever. you have the management in the room that can make you have everybody in the room that can make that decision about what to do for the company. So we call that a Meta Scrum because it's kind of the overarching above the Scrum. Now, as we've started really getting clear about how to scale really large companies, we found that this is a critical component because the biggest problem for most companies is managers are running in and disrupting the teams by messing with their backlog. And as you saw in that team, as soon as we stopped that, in the team I showed you, velocity went up 600%. So we need the managers aligned and supporting the product owner's backlog. So they need to be collaborating together and coming to agreement so that the teams can function. So this Meta Scrum has emerged. My coaches in the field have told me this has become an absolutely critical piece in these large organizations that have 1,000 developers. Because they have so many managers, they'll mess it all up if we can't get that alignment.
Okay, so I think now our time box is going to expire.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, thanks a lot.
Thanks for inviting me.
Having you here.
Yeah. It's good to see you again, always.